Welcome back to my disembodied voice. Now, horror movies are about exploiting many things which we have preconditioned judgments, stereotypes, feelings, and fears over. Be it something sensory like the feeling of pain. The Saw movies make you watch someone being tortured in the most heinous of ways, and we are asked to wince in empathy as we imagine how much that hurts. Or maybe it's something more visual, like the darkness, or what lurks beneath the depths of the ocean. Jaws being the masterful example of this, as we wonder what beast is below the waves and how futile we are when we're swimming in its domain. And even social class is something which can be exploited as, be it daunting geography, the leering tower blocks of faceless criminal turpitude, gangs of hooded thugs, or even the expensive mansion which is booby-trapped against working class criminal intruders, and the owner is always exonerated from police checks by esteemed notoriety. The economic divide has been producing great horror movies for decades. Now, societal horror isn't something new, and we have had dystopian landscapes and hellish cities all the way through, from movies like Soylent Green right to the latest Walking Dead spin-off called Dead City, where we see gangs monopolising the streets whilst hordes of the undead wander the wasteland looking for fresh humans to feed on. But what makes the economic divide such a great source of inspiration? What is it about working class and upper class which creates such gripping scenarios and makes heinous villains even more reprehensible? Well, join me today as we look at how the economic divide works for horror, creates unsettling tension, plays to our innermost psychological fears, and has all the neurological ingredients to keep us on edge and, most of all, keep us watching. Now, as ever, we're going to cover a lot of ground today, so spoilers ahoy for any movie we talk about, and in fairness and context, we're going to cover British horror, American horror, and also dabble our toes into a bit of Korean horror as well. And as ever, we'll be following a flow-through chart, and today's topics are rich versus poor, predator versus prey, alien world versus home, social Darwinism versus fight or flight. Right then, let's crack on. Now, for almost as long as there has been cinema, there have been portrayals of dystopian landscapes, the rich tyrannising the poor, and also fears about what happens between different classes when society breaks down. And in real life, the 24-hour news networks and newspapers are also quick to elevate the problems between the haves and the have-nots. And that's because by framing things through lenses of fear, tribalism and resource guarding, it creates a whole landscape which develops outrage and, most importantly for the networks, viewing figures. Now, there is much more nuance than that, and most people aren't economists but base their outlook on finite experience and prejudice. But as many news networks have corporate ownership and elite funding, we must remember that bias is shaped by funding and the goal-directed behaviour that can deflect attention from systemic issues like wage stagnation, tax avoidance, or corporate influence in politics. In other words, creating class divides, class wars, things like that is a great distraction topic for people to get angry over. But I don't want to start a debate over social stature, and whatever your political views or beliefs may be, they are your gifts to have, and I don't really care. The point I'm trying to make is, be it god-awful TV shows that highlight the crudities of lower class, the continuous painting of a landscape based upon a political bias, or the assumptions which are bred in the media, one topic will never, ever, ever go out of fashion, and that's rich versus poor. Cinema has tackled this issue for decades now, with either the poor being painted as a commodity for exploitation, or the rich an elitist faction which are beyond the reach of justice. So, we have our rich versus poor delineated in the media frequently, and that's because 24-hour news networks paint the world as an unstable mess of outrage, which keeps you in a state of flux and keeps you flocking back to them for substantiation and concreting of opinions. However, in fiction, dystopian writers have been foreshadowing the collapse of society, the uprising of the masses, and the decimation of a singular group of people for a very long time, long before we had 24-hour news networks. George Orwell's 1984, published in 1949, was a great example of corporate dystopia, but even in the movies, Soylent Green was a dark forage into the societal underbelly of grimness and the exploitation of poverty and overcrowding. Now, although not specifically saying Soylent Green's main ingredient was poor people, because it was set in an overcrowded and dystopian world, the majority of people dying were in poverty, so it's safe to say that the main ingredient in Soylent Green of nutritious protein was poor people. Now, other movies have dealt more directly with how the rich destroy the poor, and The Hunger Games, The Most Dangerous Game, Surviving the Game, Newtown Killers, 2020's The Hunt, and even Netflix's recent series Squid Game deal with the working class being defined as a commodity that are used for sport and leisure by the wealthy. Even George A. Romero's Land of the Dead deals with a dystopian world where the rich live in paradise whilst the poor scrap in the gutters below and are reduced to animals, and even the dead themselves, who eventually become led by a zombie called Big Daddy, represent a forgotten class who eventually breach the city walls and destroy everything the rich people have built. But it's not all about poor people being used as food or sport. In both movies I Came By and Bad Samaritan, working class criminals stumble across rich people's homes which harbour dark secrets and, with the authorities failing to find any accountability despite the evidence, or the evidence being hid through chicanery before the police get there, our lower class characters look like hoodlums and idiots, and the overall message here is that the rich are above reproach and cannot be arrested. Okay, so the poor are a commodity which can be exploited for amusement and nobody will care, and the rich are elitist snobs who cannot be exposed due to the immunity of their economic wealth. For the rich, the house becomes the symbolic site of horror and is used as the dichotomous class symbol. In Hugh Bonneville's house, you may remember him as the Earl of Grantham in Downton Abbey, we see a grand and elegant home on the face of it. However, once inside and in the basement, we are exposed to a world of horrific violence, torture and degradation. And in Bad Samaritan, Doctor Who's house is beautiful, if a bit sterile, but again, once inside the belly of the beast, he too is hiding a locked room of torture and sadism. So the basement dungeon becomes a metaphor for the dark underbelly of upper-class respectability, which is hidden by the economic trophies and signifiers of wealth, and, for our hoodlum protagonist, the house becomes a literal trap for the marginalised, symbolising how systems of power consume and erase the economically weak and socially vulnerable. And in Squid Game, the whole premise is that people in poverty are literally betting, fighting, mugging and stealing for something to sometimes just get through the day, yet alone clear off their debts, and each character arrives in the games with the promise of playing a little round of something childish to earn some cash. However, once they realise that moving on red light gets them killed, the horror sets in of what is truly happening. By the end of Series 1 in Squid Game, we see the wealthy funders of the game come by to drink, screw the staff and generally eat fine food whilst watching the snuff games. By Series 2 and 3, we've introduced democratic votes into the games, but as more people die and that tantalising pot of money gets bigger and bigger above their heads, there are always more people willing to play one more game rather than quit whilst they're alive because psychologically This is the whole concept of gambling. You roll the dice, and if you win, then what's to stop you from winning again and getting an even bigger prize? Gambling is addictive in itself, and once you start, imagine playing 3-card Monte, for example, where you're always winning on the first few hands, it becomes a fallacy and an illusion, as the house always wins. 3-card Monte is a con, and really in Squid Game, there can only be one winner. So whilst everyone thinks I've got a chance, the simple fact here is 455 will die, one person will get the money. So in Squid Game, each player falls for this gambler's fallacy, and that's believing a win is due after a series of losses, or they think they can work together or somehow influence the game, and even a narrow escape that brings their life to the very edge of mortality is then offset by that tempting reward of billions of won. I'm with SNL on this one, and
45 billion won. I'm confused by the currency.
And ultimately, they remember the win more than the horror of the loss, and the money pot visually tempts more reward than it reminds them of their certain death. Therefore, more players will always vote to stay as greed takes over, and these people are truly desperate. Remember, they've come from abject poverty. Looking above at
45 billion won
is just utterly overwhelming for their reward systems, their brains, their entire comprehension. And hunting, using, playing with, or just torturing the poor plays to a lot more base human psychology, and we're going to discuss that as we move on to predator versus prey. Financial success is associated with power and strength, and poverty has more negative connotations. So, with our elitist above the law, there is no better demonstration of power than killing the bottom of the financial food chain. In 2008's Newtown Killers, Dougherty Scott and his friend see benefit scroungers as the worst of the worst, and thus prey that can be hunted and killed without comeuppance or guilt, as they represent everything which is wrong with the world. Also, as poor people are desperate, they will literally do anything for some money, so they're tempted into a game of hide and seek where they can win £12,000. Our main protagonist, Sean, has a very foolish sister, played by the awesome Liz White from Life on Mars, and she owes people some serious money. So, after trying to be a rent boy, but failing at the first hurdle of actually kissing a man, Sean agrees to take part in Dougherty Scott's hide and seek. Now, a bit like the aforementioned 3-card Monte, the game is rigged and he has no chance. But once he discovers the tracker in his coat and outfoxes the businessmen, the real game begins, and we see the sociopathy that Dougherty Scott will go to by beating up teenagers and even torturing Sean's sister with boiling water to find out where he really is hiding. Seeing himself as an alpha predator, Dougherty Scott even kills his own partner once the going gets really tough, as for him, the hunt is all about winning at all costs. The money is incidental here. 12 grand falls out of these guys' pockets when they take their trousers off at night, but the pride of winning is different. That is something that causes a narcissistic injury, and one simply cannot get over that. Dougherty Scott even says this during the torture scene, where he openly talks about how working class scum make him feel sick. In the 2020 movie The Hunt, poor people are put in a game reserve and posh toffs hunt them with rifles, knives, or whatever they can get their hands on. In Squid Game, the rich are paying for an experience. They're killing vicariously, although they do have a quick go at murdering as part of the premium package in Series 3, but here, class is framed as predatory entertainment, and, like we might enjoy reality TV and seeing people humiliated and suffering, whilst we know there's no harm that comes to people in reality TV, in Squid Game, the upper-class financiers use their privilege to exploit the desperation of the working class, happily see them suffer, happily see them die, and, whilst not preying on them as food, the poor individuals in the games are just disposable entertainment. It's something you watch, enjoy, go home, and then can't wait for the series next year. Basically, the poor are prey in a sadistic sport. And this draws a stark contrast between the powerful and the powerless, with the horror emerging from the real world fear of economic desperation and dehumanisation, and just what some people will go through to get a few quid so they can lead a better life. However, be it I Came By, The Hunt, or even Newtown Killers, there's usually an inversion of the hunter-prey dynamic, and as the film progresses, take Newtown Killers for example, Shaun attempts to turn the game on its head and starts fighting back against these elitist sociopaths. This inversion subverts the typical slasher formula and underscores themes of resistance. The horror becomes psychological as it's rooted in systemic equality rather than supernatural elements, and what we get is the trading of prey versus predator. In the end of Newtown Killers, Dougherty Scott faces ruin and prison as Shaun breaks into his home, again another sterile environment of chicanery, and even the picture of Dougherty Scott's wife is a facade of fakeness. And Shaun sends all his crimes to his entire business network and thus exposes his illegality of hunting poor people. And in I Came By, there is a truly staggering amount of failed attempts to bring the Earl of Grantham from Downton Abbey to justice, and the ending devolves into a brute force and truly visceral fight. But as the rules of the inversion of predator versus prey, the tables are turned and the predator must suffer. But fighting back isn't easy, and part of the reason class is so good in horror is because it uses our biggest psychological fears and manipulates the familiar into the darkness as it plays with alien world versus home. The darkest corners of the most poverty-stricken council estates or the most opulent stately homes of the rich must become a nightmarish alien world which increases the tension. Council estates, or the projects as they're known in America, are always scary places for movies. The labyrinth of tower blocks and dark alleyways are a wonderful place for hunters to hunt their prey and for people to feel isolated, scared, out of their depth, and a way to induce fear in the viewer. They offer inescapability with maze-like corridors, sealed doors, and are genuinely hard to escape from, and they leave you with the feeling that the protagonist is trapped inside these areas with even more dangerous criminals and even more thuggish people. They are full of visual cues like urban isolation and neglect, with empty or poorly maintained buildings, broken lifts, dim lighting, and graffiti, which creates an eerie atmosphere of abandonment, and are shown as cut off from wider society, which enhances the feeling that anything could happen without outside help, and social realism is always more frightening than the occult. Now, as with many movies, we're playing to the gallery of stereotypes here, but that's not just the poor. When we come to the rich, big stately homes are just as bad in terms of making them into alien worlds, and in both I Came By and Bad Samaritan, each house is a fortress of hell, which, the deeper into it the protagonist goes, the worse things become. Now, Bad Samaritan doesn't specifically deal with Doctor Who hunting the poor, but he does keep people locked away in his basement, and as he's about to be robbed by criminals who use their valet jobs to steal from the rich by using sat-navs to get to their home addresses, just like the Earl of Grantham from Downton Abbey, the house in Bad Samaritan represents power and privilege as a shield. Status and affluence makes these people untouchable, and with psychopathically charming, cultured and above suspicion antagonist, both Hugh Bonneville and Doctor Who's crimes go unchecked. And it's not because they're brilliant at hiding them, but it's because they have a long-standing social status that protects them. And, much like the real world, this social status reflects the horror of real-world systems that often fail to hold the elite class accountable. However, once the protagonist is in the house with security systems, trips and traps, the horror ratchets up, and each time you see the antagonist heading home whilst the protagonist is trapped, we feel that tension rise. Like I said, the darkened room is normally in a basement, and that very much is symbolic to the underbelly of the high social classes, that seediness we don't see but we always assume is going on. In the movie Newtown Killers, despite living on the council estate, Sean has to dive into even seedier areas of that world to escape. It's a metaphorical dive into sort of Dante's Inferno and the circles of hell, and as Sean goes deeper into this alien world and deeper into danger, the world becomes narrower. There are less escape routes, and the thugs and criminals and degenerates only get worse. Dougherty Scott isn't bothered and easily dispatches thugs who try to intimidate him, but for Sean, our protagonist, even the geography of this estate, where he used to free run and hide from the police, becomes a narrowing trap, which means his lifespan is getting shorter the deeper he goes. Films have long since used council estates as nightmarish hellscapes. Candyman, Come Down, and one of my personal favourite films, Tower Block, are all good examples of urban decay in horror, but in the class wars, the urban decay must pose multiple horrors and challenges, as poverty is the reason the subject is so desperate, and the estate is the metaphor and the visual representation of this poverty. And for the rich, that sterile gated community is all about hiding secrets and being a facade for evil, and once inside, getting out is a damn sight harder than breaking in. Wealth conceals evil, and as people start vanishing in I Came By, nobody cares. Even the brilliant Get Out plays with this, as the wealthy family abduct black men from neighbourhoods, and nobody really cares once their brains have been operated on and they're long gone and the police just put it down to another missing person. Power protects wealth, and in horror, the police are no use, so the protagonist is going to need to use cunning, brute force, and all of their wits if they're going to have any chance of surviving. Okay, so the marginalised are disposable and the rich can buy freedom through reputation and status, but in terms of psychology, when we incorporate class into horror, we come up with the final point today, which is social Darwinism versus fight or flight. Inequality and survival of the fittest does apply in class-based horror, as our protagonists are outmatched and will either need to run or fight to survive. Now, social Darwinism is a long discredited and controversial ideology, but we're in the land of movies and TV shows here, so we're taking it as a valid villainous ideology. The killers in Newtown Killers, the rich in Squid Game, Doctor Who in Bad Samaritan, and pretty much every other cabal or syndicate or villainy in social horror justify their actions through a twisted form of social Darwinism, and that is believing that only the strong or rich survive. This ideology becomes the true horror of the film, the allegory for a society where empathy is eroded by capitalism and elitism. In Newtown Killers, we know exactly what the hunters think of their prey. Benefit-scrounging scumbags who leech off their hard-earned taxes. In Squid Game, one of those people will get a better life with the confusing currency of 46 billion won. So, the fact that these rich people are going to make one person rich by killing 455 other people is almost a fair trade. Someone gets a better life from us, if you will. In horror films, money and class makes you better, and you're protected, and this makes the poor a fair game. Now, let me be clear here. The graffiti artists in I Came By are breaking into homes and committing crimes, and I'm not condoning those sorts of crimes or forgiving them for it. The same goes for the robbers in Bad Samaritan. But the point here is that although those are petty crimes and deserve to be punished, once they go into the rich house and make the discovery of the real heinous crimes, it causes a change in terms of their character's direction, and we see the good in them as they immediately try and help the locked up victim. It's important that our working class people are seen as having to steal or commit crimes for survival or fighting the system, but when the morals hit the fan, they are 100% good and would never stoop so low. It separates them then. Yes, they might be doing a crime, but they would never kill, rape, lock someone up in a basement. They just wouldn't do it, so we have a moral compass to follow in them. So, in both Bad Samaritan and I Came By, the guys are kind of petty criminals, but the crimes being committed by the rich people are much worse, and this changes our protagonists and causes them to become philanthropic, guilt-ridden, and try and help. Economic desperation is always the catalyst for their crimes of robbing the rich, and a bit like the rich see the poor as not real people, the poor robbing the rich will look at it as they can afford it. What's one less ivory back scratcher, to quote The Simpsons. And it's important in horror that we separate those two. Yes, they're petty criminals, but they're not sadists who enjoy torturing or killing people. In I Came By specifically, class disparity is shown as a source of psychological and systemic horror, as it shows how wealth can conceive evil and how the powerless can be made invisible, and, should they vanish, nobody will care at all. And in Squid Game, 456 people are taken off the streets and vanish, and such is the population and poverty in those cities. Again, nobody cares. In the rich's eyes, they have the right to do this, and they will hunt and amuse themselves with the poor, and even in the Hunger Games, where the districts have to nominate tributes, the rich sit back and enjoy canapes, whilst the poor massacre each other or fight to the death, or generally just get tortured. However, be it The Hunt or Newtown Killers or Squid Game, there has to be a fight back, and even if Squid Game isn't so much about a single individual beating the corporation, the sheer determination of the main character and his financed band of investigatory thugs means that he must try and survive for as long as possible until they find what island he is on. In Newtown Killers, Sean has 12 hours to stay alive so he can get his £12,000, and in I Came By, all attempts at fight and flight have been foiled, and only the most richest and respected survive, even though the police know something is going wrong, partly because their boss is Hugh Bonneville's best friend, and at the end, the thing has to devolve into a really brutal fight back, which is just fists on fists, weapons on weapons, and actual hardcore violence. Even Get Out's climax is bathed in blood and violence, as the protagonist has no other way to escape except use fight and both run, bludgeon and cudgel his way out of that prison and get to freedom. Horror in Class is brilliant. It plays with expectations, it plays with subversions, it plays to our own stereotypes and beliefs, and it turns people around. Moralistic grey characters become good, and what looks like a very wealthy, respectable, surely a noble person has that turned on its head, and we find out they are actually evil, unpleasant and sadists. I personally love it, and I love those kind of horror films. Anyway, that's it for this week's video. So remember that psychology is cool. Please like, share and subscribe, as more subs means more vids, or even leave a comment or start a discussion, as healthy debate is always welcome on here. And as ever, until next time, I'll catch you later.